joining us. It is a little bit late in the day. We appreciate your enthusiasm as well as your attendance, and I know we have evening events too, so we'll get started on time so people can prepare for those efforts. I want to express my appreciation to the mayors who rolled up their sleeves and got involved in the immigration issue. Obviously, this is not a job for the meek, but I think this is an example of how this organization can be most effective. We can gather as mayors, regardless of party, and take on an issue that has divided much of America for a long, long time and come up with a policy paper that we think makes good sense and can be a building block for future legislation and future ideas from this organization and from other government agencies. So I specifically want to thank the Mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, Mayor of Anaheim, Tom Tate, Mayor Elorza from Providence, and Mayor Murray from Seattle for their willingness to get involved in this very important effort. Also, I know the staff of the U.S. Conference of Mayors was heavily involved in getting information and helping them with the language that was so important at the end. But with that, I'm going to step aside and let them take the stage and explain more and hopefully help engage you in this continual conversation on immigration in the United States. Here's the Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and thank you for your great leadership here today and being a part of our emergency resolution. Thank you to everybody who I know this is usually the last session of the day is the toughest one, but thankfully today we're sponsored by Coca-Cola, so get your caffeine. And I want to thank Coca-Cola for their great sponsorship of today. How's that? Is that good? Did I get that done? All right. Hold on one sec. So good. This is a joint meeting of the United States Conference of Mayors, Latino Alliance, Immigration Task Force, and Police Chief Task Force, bringing together three of my favorite things. I say that as somebody who traces my ancestry back to Mexico on my father's side, as somebody who's keenly interested in the issue of immigration, and as somebody who every single day knows that a mayor's job one is public safety. And it's a pretty extraordinary gathering to have the intellectual firepower, the professional experience that's up here and out in the audience. To talk about, all joking aside, probably the most pressing issues or issue that we face as mayors right now in many of our communities. Feeling of uncertainty, feeling of great need around the issue of immigration in our cities and our communities. Earlier today, Mayors Tate, Elorza, Murray, and I presented an emergency resolution on immigration to the conference's executive committee. And I want to thank all of the mayors, but I also want to thank especially Tom Tate to show that this is a bipartisan thing. And he brought together Republican mayors as we brought together Democratic mayors. And look, we cross the aisle very easily here. One of the last places where Americans can see and believe that bipartisan spaces exist in this country because mayors have to represent everybody and have to find those practical solutions. But we were very proud that this conference adopted that motion. And we got in the midst of President Obama's last press conference and Nancy Pelosi's press conference on health care. We actually had quite a few cameras looking at what America's mayors are talking about, because we represent all of this country and we represent its hopes and its dreams. With indulgence to a couple people who heard a bit of this today, I just want to start in a very personal way. I'm the product on both sides of my family. As I said earlier this summer when I spoke at the DNC, I'm just your average Mexican, American, Jewish, Italian. And if you can't get elected with that, you're not worth your political weight. But my Italian last name really doesn't tell you the full story, that my father's side of the family came from Mexico. My grandfather was the latest immigrant about 100 years ago during the Mexican Revolution, who came over the border when my grandfather was killed in the revolution during that violence. And my bisabuela, or great-grandmother, carried him over the border in her arms, looking for opportunity. We didn't have the term dreamer or undocumented back then, but we're pretty sure he crossed that border without any documentation. We know that because in World War II, after he grew up as a young man, he wasn't drafted by this country, but this was his country, so he volunteered to fight for this country and serve this nation and earned his citizenship. Now, interestingly enough, my grandfather on my Jewish side, on my mother's side, was the son of immigrants, and his father was a tailor who in East LA during the war with his son, my grandfather Harry, started making uniforms for our soldiers. And the reason I tell that story is I have two different immigrant sides. One crossed an ocean, one crossed a river. One made the uniforms in World War II, another one wore the uniforms. And that's what this country is about, that each of us has a role to play in our patriotism and in finding our dreams. And the reason I think why we care so much about this issue collectively is the time for action for all of us is to go back to those stories in our own families and in our own communities, where in cities like my own, where 61% of our Main Street businesses are started by immigrants, and we don't know how many of them are documented and undocumented, where we know that we need every resident to feel safe talking to a police officer, to be a witness to a crime or help solve a case or reduce gang violence or shootings in our communities. That bipartisan support, just look up the Hill at Congress, where two of the three main sponsors of new legislation to protect Dreamers are Republicans, both Senator Flake and Senator Graham, together with Senator Durbin, who have introduced legislation to try to make sure that we find a legislative solution that will help people marching towards that pathway towards citizenship, which makes our community stronger, which makes our country stronger, and also one in which is rooted in the practicality of what we do as mayors. I shared this earlier in the press conference, but in Los Angeles, we did a study, and 40% was the average wage increase for folks who got temporary status under this past administration to their immigration status. The last thing we want to do, regardless of ideology, is push people back under the table where they work for less than the minimum wage, because you can't round up every immigrant even if you wanted to. People get due process, and many cities like ours are coming together to even provide legal funds to make sure that people get that due process that our Constitution guarantees. And in doing so, we want to make sure everybody's wages come up, which is what happens when we integrate people in. When we use our libraries like we're doing in Los Angeles and in other cities to form citizenship corners that have served over 47,000 residents in my city on the pathway to citizenship. The millions of Americans who are legal residents but have not yet become citizens who could do so tomorrow. And the work that mayors can do to connect with them to a stronger civic bond to the country where they live. And I think that all of us today feel very strongly that we stand united to say that local progress will not slow down, even if progress in Washington sometimes feels like it does, or in Washington can't get the job done. But maybe it's a perverse feeling to have right now, but I'm actually kind of hopeful. At these inflection points when government changes, when people open up opportunities, when they see the human face of an issue rather than the ideological stance of it, we realize that immigrants aren't them, they're us. We might not be immigrants ourselves, but they're our coworker, the person across the desk from us, the person serving us, the person protecting us. I went recently to a graduation of our police cadets, and we were at the University of Southern California's basketball arena, and we had over 1,000 young people participating and graduating in that. And I would say in my city, there was about 70% of them were immigrants or the children of immigrants. And it occurred to me here were young people at a difficult moment in policing who were volunteering to go down that pipeline. Some of them will become police officers, but were literally protecting their communities. And I took a picture of them just so people could see that sea of faces and had a hashtag that, protect our immigrants, hashtag our immigrants protect us. And they do, whether it's the economic security of our communities, or whether it's the way that they volunteer to fight in the war. Dreamers get a lot of attention, as they should, but there's 50,000 undocumented parents who have legal status right now of our service members. So their sons and daughters are wearing the uniform of this country. They may or may not come back to those communities, and yet if they do come back, their parents, if deportation were to occur or they were to lose their legal status right now, they would be deported. That's un-American. And the ways that we can find practical solutions to make sure that immigrants are incorporated into our community is what this panel is all about today. So I won't go on any further, but I really want to thank everybody who is a part of this today. And I want to thank also Tom Cochran and the staff of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. One thing as the chair and founder of the Latino Alliance is one of the things we want to do in working with our partners at Holland and Knight is to give you guys briefings on what's happening, because the legal landscape will change extremely quickly. We don't know what is coming. We hope for the best, but we have to prepare for the worst, and we need to know what the law is as it changes, legislatively, executive action, et cetera. And so we will start, together with U.S. Conference, send out those briefings to all mayors and to cities to know what the landscape looks like so that you can not only deal with that, but also hear the best practices of what cities are doing to represent the interests of their residents and to ensure that we continue that progress. So I want to thank Holland and Knight for that as well. So our first speaker that I'm going to turn things over to is Mayor Jorge Elorza, who is a dear friend, the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, and somebody who is the co-chair with Tom Tate of our Immigration Task Force. He was the co-sponsor of our resolution today, and he's spoken powerfully, I think, of his personal connection to why this is such an important issue to him, but also why an entire continent away from where I live, why this resonates throughout this entire land. So please welcome our Immigration Task Force co-chair, Jorge Elorza.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. You know, it truly is special. I've been to many of these conferences now over the past couple of years, and you know, late in the day, it's tough to get a crowd for these kinds of sessions. But it makes me tremendously proud that my colleagues throughout the entire country prioritize this enough to not only be here, but to be active participants in what we're doing. So I thank you all for being part of this conversation and being part of this effort. As Mayor Garcetti mentioned, this is personal to me, just as it is personal to many folks here in the community. And as we've started talking over the past couple of months, I want to give a personal thanks and show my deep appreciation and gratitude for Mayor Garcetti's leadership in bringing this together, in putting together the resolution and helping to organize this great group of leaders to sit amongst us today. I want to thank Mayor Tom Tate, my co-chair on the Immigration Task Force, along with Mayor Ed Murray from the great city of Seattle, for being a leader and a strong voice on this issue, along with his Chief of Police, Chief O'Toole. So, one thing that's important to remember when we talk about immigration is that, much of this conversation has been about undocumented immigrants. And I hear oftentimes in the community from well-meaning folks that, they have no problem with immigration, except that they believe that folks should do it the right way. They should get in line, go through the proper channels, etc. But I am always reminded, and I remind them, that generations upon generations of immigrants have come to this country and faced the same kind of resistance, regardless of how they've come here. Even when they have been legal immigrants, generations of Irish immigrants, generations of Italian immigrants, generations of Jewish immigrants, they faced resistance and they faced pushback. Many of us are familiar with Irish need not apply. Many of us know that the Italians were called WAPs, for without papers. And in fact, as an interesting note, the term illegal immigrant was first used in 1939 as a slur against Jews who were fleeing Nazi Germany in Britain. And so just as these generations of immigrants have faced this pushback, this backlash, and this discrimination, we also know that these generations of immigrants have always found caring, warm-hearted, good-natured people who have welcomed them. There's a long legacy of settlement houses, of churches and synagogues and civic groups that have welcomed immigrant groups, helped get them on their feet and integrated into their new world. And so what we're doing here today is all part of this long legacy that continues this work. And I understand that as mayors in our separate cities, we're all at different places. And I'll tell you a bit of a funny story. About a year ago, I held an immigration forum when the Trump campaign began and the anxiety began to rise. We brought about 300 or 400 people from the community into a church. We invited a federal immigration official, a state leader, and we had some municipal leaders speaking on immigration. And it was a success. We brought the community together and reassured them that we have their back. And an immigrant community member came to me. He says, I came to this country 20 years ago. And if you would have told me 20 years ago that you would announce that federal immigration officials would be speaking at a certain place and undocumented immigrants would be coming to it rather than fleeing from it, I would have told you you were crazy. But because of the work that was done by so many mayors up until that point, we had built up that goodwill with the community. And so I know many of us in our own home cities, we have that goodwill to build upon, but I know some of us still have a ways to go. And so there's no one-size-fits-all approach to the work that we want to do. But going forward as part of this collective group and through the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we trust that our coalition can be, first and foremost, a clearinghouse of information to help disseminate best practices about what we're doing in this effort across the country. So, for example, many of us have brought together the immigrant community in Know Your Right forums throughout our cities. As Mayor Garcetti mentioned, some of us are making great use of our local libraries and community spaces and safe spaces to disseminate this information and to bring folks together. You know, we've also had cities who have adopted municipal ID programs. While they may not give anyone a right to board a plane or even to drive a car, it does give immigrants a sense of security in knowing that they belong to that community. They're official because they have a card, and this also helps them access banking. In Providence, we also recently sent a letter home with all of our students, reassuring all undocumented immigrant parents that whenever they have a concern, they should feel as though they have a voice and they have a place inside of our school department. And so there's much that we can do in our local communities, tailored, of course, to our unique challenges and where we stand, to reassure the immigrant community that we have their back. So second, we see this initiative also providing a network of support. A couple of months ago, after the election, when the whole sanctuary city issue really came to the fore, it was very difficult for the first group of mayors to say, yes, we are sanctuary cities and we're not changing our policies. But I'm sure every single mayor who did take that step was reassured when they heard that New York, that Chicago, that LA, that cities throughout the United States were also standing firm. And so, you know, that provided a great deal of cover for me personally, as I know it did for others. When our constituents were concerned about losing federal funds, they knew that we did not stand alone. And last, you know, we hope this initiative also provides a means of providing proactive communications, talking points, and advocacy. And this is something that I think is tremendously important, because the undocumented immigrant debate has been framed so much in terms of us versus them, and it has placed us in a position where we almost have to defend the other side. If immigrants are being painted as criminals and as rapists, you know, it doesn't help to continue that line and say, no, we're not, etc. Instead, I believe that we can go on the offensive and truly champion what immigrants actually represent and what they do. Immigrants are some of the most resilient, most industrious, and most honest people that anyone will find. They're assets to all of our communities, and they're natural entrepreneurs. In the year 2010, a report told us that 40%, a full 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by either immigrants or their children. Immigrants are an asset to all of our community, and instead of insulting and expelling, we should be championing and welcoming. And so I'm so proud of our colleagues who have all come together, and we hope that this initiative will provide the kind of support on a very practical and tangible way that will allow us to do our work, to protect our folks, and to reassure them that they are safe in our communities. And we hope to keep building this coalition to get the message out that we should be proud of the immigrants that we have in our community. America is already great, not in spite of our immigrants, but because of them. Thank you.
Superb words. Thank you so much, Mayor Elorza, and I'm very proud to serve with you. Thank you for what you bring to this. Next, I'd like to ask Tom Tate, a man who's been a superstar in this conference. You saw him in Indianapolis talk about the idea of a city of kindness, and really, I think, got us all to reflect not on just the practical work, but some of the ethical work that we can do. And I think it's from that wellspring that he leads as one of the most kind of ethically driven mayors and leaders that we have in the United States, certainly in Southern California as well, and I want to welcome Tom Tate forward now, too.
Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. So we've been having this task force for a few years now. Usually they're early in the morning, and usually we have a pretty small crowd, right, Jorge? This is by far the largest crowd we've had, and you know, if we close down the bar downstairs, it'd even be bigger. So it's much bigger. No, thank you all for being here. Jorge's words were beautiful. And this it's appropriate, and it makes sense that mayors would bring this issue forward, that they'd be pushing Congress and the administration to do something on this issue. It reminds me of a word, it's a German word, Mitsein, and it doesn't really translate well to English, but best it translates is being with. And something about that word, about being with, and that's what we do as mayors, and we are with the community. And we see firsthand what a broken system it is, and the human cost of this broken system, and the community cost. So over the past few years, I've taken on the role of co-chairing with Mayor Elorza, the U.S. Conference of Mayors Immigration Reform Task Force, for the sole purpose of urging Congress and the administration to fix our nation's broken immigration system. Now, Jorge is a Democrat and I'm a Republican. He's from the East Coast, I'm from the West Coast, but that is all irrelevant to this issue, because we are both committed to bringing bipartisanship to this immigration issue. Our emphasis has been to work with other mayors in a bipartisan manner in order to send a message to the President and Congress that there's widespread support for immediate action on this issue. I think you'd all agree that regardless of politics, region, or size of city, mayors have a unique perspective on this issue and deal with the impacts of a broken immigration system on a daily basis. In my community, as with all of yours, social infrastructure is critically important. We all want our cities to become stronger, more resilient, and healthy. We all work hard to build community bonds. When we have an environment where a subsection of our community lives in a state of uncertainty and fear, it's difficult for that city or for the entire community, the entire city, to thrive. Now more than ever, it's important that mayors across the country speak with a strong, unified voice on this important issue. And hopefully our voice can be a catalyst for congressional action. And the message is simple. Now is the time for our federal government to fix our nation's broken immigration system. While we all may have different opinions on the specifics of the new immigration policy, the immediate goal is to get our congressional leaders to prioritize this issue and start working on a solution now. There will be plenty of time for each of us to weigh in on the details later. As you have heard, the U.S. Conference of Mayors Executive Committee approved an emergency resolution earlier today that calls on Congress and the administration to act. I'm proud to say that we put the resolution together in a bipartisan spirit, and I hope it is something that you all can support. I want to thank Mayor Garcetti and Mayor Elorza and the staff and Mick for all their leadership and work on this issue. While the resolution is important, the work doesn't stop today. We will continue to work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors leadership staff to weigh in with our congressional leaders and the administrations and ask them, on behalf of our nation's mayors, please fix our broken immigration system. I ask that you support these efforts as we move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mayor Tate. A man who just up the coast from the two of us has been leading the fight on so much, from minimum wage to infrastructure, great success in the November elections there, but also who has really made that nexus between policing, which is a national conversation on so many fronts, but has connected that to our immigration discussion, has been the great mayor of the city of Seattle. Please welcome Ed Murray.
Thank you. It is an honor to be up here with my fellow mayors. I'm just going to take a few minutes because I want to turn this over to our Chief of Police, Kathleen O'Toole. But I do want to take a moment and tell you why what we have done today and what we're doing here in this room is so important to the people of my city. So 1 in 5 Seattleites was born in a different country. And like you probably have gone to your schools, as I did the day after the election. And I talked to students. I was in a classroom, mostly children of color, and most of them were Latino. And as the conversation went on, they were 13-year-olds. Most of them were actually undocumented. And the fear and the hurt that I heard from those students sounded a lot like the fear and the hurt that my grandfather talked about when he first came to this country in the early part of the last century from Ireland. He lived in New York City. But it was also the fear and the hurt that I hear in my husband's family, who are Japanese American. My grandparents and his grandparents came to this country at the same time. My grandparents could become citizens and vote. His grandparents couldn't until after the 1950s. My grandparents could own their bakery in New York City. His grandparents could not own their laundry in Spokane, Washington. The children had to own the laundry. So I think it is so incredibly important that we are here today because of our history, and because that history has sent fear not just to a younger generation, but to people who have lived through this experience in our history before in this country. So the chief is going to come up and talk about our relationship between our police department and our immigrant communities, regardless of their status. But one of the things we're doing that I want to speak about before she begins is what we can do up front to prevent folks from ever being caught up in the system. What can we do to make sure that people have their documentation who are qualified for it? What can we do for those who have not followed up on citizenship to get citizenship? What can we do to give people the education and the language skills? Seattle launched a series of programs in all of these areas over the last few years. And for an example, on Inauguration Day, we expect 1,000 immigrants to show up at the Seattle Center where the Space Needle is to learn about how they can get assistance to go to the next step. So that's what we are doing. And in a minute, you'll hear what the police are doing. But let me end with another story, since we were talking about our own American story of being immigrants. So when I looked at the documentation of my grandfather who came here as a child, and I noticed his father's name, and I noticed some of his siblings, but I didn't see my great-grandmother's name and the rest of his siblings. And so it turned out we had a family secret, and because we're Irish, it didn't have to do with alcohol. They were turned back, and of course no one ever actually went back. They went to Canada and they walked across the border. And my grandfather then went on to raise a family in New York City and to be the grandfather of not one mayor but two mayors, one in New Jersey, and the great-grandfather of another mayor also in New Jersey, and myself. Chief O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Mayor. It's such a privilege to work with such a great, forward-thinking mayor, and we are joined at the hip when it comes to police policy in Seattle. I'm sure that most of the mayors here recognize that in policing, things can go wrong very quickly, and we're all vulnerable if that's the case, so it's so important to work together on these complicated issues. As Mayor Garcetti noted earlier, with a name like O'Toole, obviously I'm the product of Irish immigrants too, and in fact my Irish granny was my inspiration throughout my life. She was given a ticket one day to travel to America, and less than 12 hours later she was on a ship and arrived in this country in New York with only the clothes on her back. And she arrived to those signs that read Irish need not apply, but she was resilient. She went on to work as a maid for the rest of her life. Well, actually until she was 91, and then after she quit working, unfortunately, she deteriorated and passed away. So the moral of that story is we should all stay working for as long as possible. But she was certainly the greatest example of adventure and courage and resilience and decency that I've ever known in my life. So again, we're all here inspired by our immigrant parents, grandparents, and others. So when I was appointed police commissioner in Boston, this was many years ago, prior to my move to Seattle, there was a lot of interest about this woman with Irish connections that was appointed police commissioner, and an Irish TV crew came to interview me, human interest story, but the first question asked was, Commissioner, what's your position on the undocumented in Boston? It wasn't a question I expected at the time, but I quickly responded, if they're involved in guns, gangs, or drugs, I'm concerned. Otherwise, I could care less. And that continues to be my position today. But working as Boston Commissioner and more recently as the chief in Seattle, we need to engage with our immigrant and refugee communities, whether they're documented or undocumented. Otherwise, our cities, our neighborhoods will not be safe. We have a large immigrant refugee population in Seattle. We had a large immigrant refugee population in Boston. And not only were these people contributing to our cities, but in many respects, they were the most vulnerable in our cities. And we knew as police officers, as police leaders, we had to reach out, establish relationships, and build trust with those communities. Personally, I went out and I've gone out to many churches, to many community centers, often with translators saying, we don't care about your immigration status. We care about your safety and the safety of your children. In Seattle, we started an immigrant family, a refugee family institute where we pair police officers as mentors with immigrant families to help them through their difficult times and to build that trust that's so important. We've also worked very closely with youth because, of course, we're building the next generation of trust between the police and the community. And Mayor has been a strong advocate for youth employment in the city of Seattle, particularly for young men and women of color, and more particularly for immigrant and refugee families. So this past year, for instance, we hired 30 young people to work in the Seattle Police Department for the summer. And when they first arrived at City Hall and they were told they were working for the police department, they said, ugh, you know, we have to work with the police? And then when we told them they were going to make $15 an hour, they said, yes, we want to work for the police. But it was amazing to see the relationship that developed over the course of the summer between our police and these young immigrants. Many of them here in a new country, trying to make their way, and we gave them a skills-building opportunity to develop their own confidence, and also to help us engage with their extended families. So I could tell you about dozens of programs we're doing with the immigrant and refugee communities. I'm happy to share them with members of your city's administrations, but at the same time, it all comes down to trust, and we need to provide that support to the most vulnerable in our community, whether they're documented or undocumented immigrants. As a police chief, I've worked for both Democrats and Republicans. This is not a partisan issue. I work where the rubber meets the road, trying to keep our communities safe, and I just want to say that I was heartened today to hear the bipartisan voices in favor of coming up with a common sense solution to this very significant issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. Well, thank you to each of our speakers for sharing those perspectives in such a personal and such a straightforward way. In the last 20 minutes, we have a few questions, I think, from mayors that are out there, either statements or we encourage questions rather than statements, but for the panel, but also eager to hear the things that you are doing. First, from the great city of Austin, I'd like to ask Steve Adler to address the panel or to share some things that you're doing in Austin. Steve.
Well, first, let me say thank you to the mayors on the dais for doing this work. This is an issue with the uncertainty that's been in this country over a period of time, and certainly over the last half year. It's hard to put out of your mind the image of kids that are crying, not wanting to go to school because they can't be guaranteed that their parents will be there when they come back late in the day. The fear is palpable, and in a very real sense, more now than any time in my short career as being mayor, I feel that my answers are not substantial enough. I don't have a good answer because we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know what's going to be happening in the future. So everything I say falls short of the answers that people want to hear. But what we can say, and what we repeat in Austin, is that while some things may be changing or not, we'll see some things are not changing, and what has not changed is our community and our values and who we are. And for all the reasons that you've given, the safety and the community that we have fortunate to have the same kind of relationship with our public safety folks, and quite frankly, they provide a lot of cover for elected politicians and communities, and for that, we're thankful. But there is a desire to try to do more. We are a blue city in a red state. We've had tweets from our governor telling us he's going to ban us shortly. I'm not exactly sure what that means for a city, but in case we need airdrops, we'll call for it.
It's because you're so weird in Austin, and you love it.
That's how that works.
Stay weird, right?
But I love the three things that you're focusing on, because I think that they're going to be real important. Yep. At no time, I think, in my time with this organization have I both been as proud to be a member of this organization, as well as to see what I think is the critical importance. Because in this conversation, the most effective national counterbalance on the issue of immigration and on protecting immigrants and keeping our communities safe are the mayors. And I think that the strength of the mayors that have spoken out have helped all of us and provided a context for all of us to speak in. And the possibility exists at some point in the future that there will come a day when all the mayors, if they were to speak out at the same time, using the same language at the same moment, would be incredibly powerful in the community, and I'm not sure there is any body or group of people that could provide that the same way that the mayors could. So I love the effort that you're doing. In our community, we're trying to do things you're talking about. I would add to the list. We're going to go so far as we're appropriating money from our budget to fund legal aid in our communities so that we increase the ability to handle the growing number of folks that are seeking legal assistance. What we've said to our community more broadly is we're not funding anybody to circumvent the law, but just to ensure that people who have rights actually have the ability to exercise those rights. And there can't be anything more American in our system than that. And in that context, it received a lot of good favor in our community. I would like to have a better feel for what the logistics are of what you're proposing. The ability to be able to have that information accessible would be real important. To be able to have the best practices so that we can see what other cities are doing like this would be real important, and to have that in as a real-time moment as possible. And also from a communication standpoint, so that on that day, if that day ever arises, and all the days in between, that when I stand up and say something to the media, I'm using the same words that the other mayors are using around the country, I think would have the greatest weight. How are you going to handle the logistics of what it is that you're proposing? Because I think it would be incredibly valuable.
Thank you so much, Steve. A few things. First of all, I think the easiest way to think about this, and feel free, anybody else on the stage, to jump in, is if you want an acronym, it's READ. Reassure, engage, and defend. I think that first step is a necessary one for mayors personally, which is to reassure a very jittery, or even worse, extremely frightened population. I think that do not underscore the importance of the city's mother or father standing up and saying, you're going to be okay. Even when we don't know how to figure that out. We do that as parents all the time, right? You're going to be okay even as we figure out the next step, but we need to make sure that people hear that. Second, engage, and there's a couple ways to engage, and I'll talk a little bit about the playbook to get there, but on legal and legislative strategies. There will be a lot of us who are looking at not the legal defense piece, which I'll get to in a second, but the legal strategies, as we saw Texas do with the current president and others. We can have that same role of challenging in courts some of the things like people's personal information being used because they applied for, let's say, DACA status as a way of telling agents how to get to someone's address, and other legal defenses that will be done kind of on the broad legal strategy. Legislatively, there's legislation right now. As I mentioned, two bills that have been put forward in the Senate. They think they can get a 60 vote out of the 60 votes out of the Senate to protect the Dreamers and some of the people who have this temporary status for the next few years. We need to do that work in the House as well and make sure it's not vetoed. So I think there's legislative ways we can engage and legislation you can do even at your local and state level. And then last, defend comes down to those individual cases. And a lot of us have increasingly looked at ways to either raise privately with foundations and other money or a combination of public and private dollars, these justice funds. We're doing one in Los Angeles as well. And as I shared in the press conference, immigration courts move so slowly right now that the idea of some sort of mass deportation happening, if there is due process, and I would expect that we're not going to lose at least due process, but you never know these days, you would slow the courts up so much that these will take years to get through. And we do want to give people that due process right. For what it's worth, we know that there's not the capacity in even a city like Los Angeles, which is ground zero for this just to be done through legal aid. There's not enough capacity to be just through private lawyers who are immigration lawyers, not enough capacity just to do through pro bono. So we're funding all three. And we're doing it through, because we just need the bodies, literally. We're going to have thousands. The moment you say you have this, you will get hundreds of calls in your community, or in some communities, tens of thousands of calls, as we do. So really, you need to prepare ahead of time. And then the last piece I'll say is we are working together with the staff of the U.S. Conference to put together a playbook to highlight what some of the best practices are. So if you have a program that you want to make sure is highlighted to the rest of your fellow mayors, let us know so we can put that into what this kind of communications will be every couple of weeks on what the legal status is, or emergency communications as things change. So we'll give you that kind of legal update. We'll give you a playbook. And then lastly, on the communications front, we are working to see if we can find somebody to help us kind of who specializes in this so we can work off the same playbook, or at least suggest it. We'll all say what we need to and nuance that for our own communities, but it would be good to have us all speaking off roughly the same page. Anything anybody want to add to that? Tom?
We're planning on putting a letter together, a bipartisan letter, with some very simple points. Send it to all the mayors. I imagine a letter with a couple hundred, 300 mayors signing it. We send it to the Congress and the administration asking for this. So that's the next step, and Jorge and I will be working on that here in the next couple weeks.
Mayor Hancock, are you out there? Where's Mayor Hancock? There he is. Mayor Hancock of Denver. Love to hear your perspectives or questions.
Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. Let me join Mayor Adler in thanking the mayors who are leading this effort on our nation's behalf, a nation of mayors. Like many of you, we watched our city fall with a pall after the election. And I'll never forget the day after the election, it was almost like it was like there had national tragedy had occurred. And it was easy for all of us, of course, to think our candidate lost. But there was something different about this pall this time. We've all have run or been part of campaigns that have lost. And so this one was almost like someone had died, and everybody had, was feeling the pain of what occurred. And I went home that night, and it dawned on me that beyond just the fact that our candidate didn't win, there were some values that we all believe in wholeheartedly that had been violated. And particularly with regards to immigration, the values of openness, the values of inclusivity, the values of fairness, humanity, opportunity, the values that everyone is worthy and everyone matters. And when I went back to work a couple days later, of course, the voice of a young man, Mayor Murray, third grader, who was at a rally that I attended just before the election to talk about the safety tips for walking to school, or tips for walking to school safely, who approached me after we had a nice jam session with kids dancing, third graders, with tears in his eyes. Jorge was his name. And he grabbed my hand and he said, "Could you do me a favor and make sure that Donald Trump is not elected so my parents won't get deported?" And I'll never forget the promise I gave to Jorge that I would. And he didn't have to worry about Donald Trump being elected. Well, I felt bad after the election that I somehow had to find Jorge and explain to him that we'll do what we can to protect he and his family. But I want to join Mayor Adler and all of you up there who've said this. The mayors are the front line on this issue, and that these are not programs. Immigration is not a program. It's a value. And that's why we feel so strongly about it. That's why when we close our eyes and people say, "Get over it, you lost," we can't get over it because you have violated our values. You have impugned the things that we believe in so deeply about this nation. and that everyone in this room, everyone in this country are here because we were immigrants first. And so I hope that mayors across the nation, and I hope you would encourage this. One of the things that I found very powerful were not so much policies, but sometimes people simply need to know they're going to be okay.
That's right.
They just need to hear that.
That's right.
And when we issued a 1 minute and 30-second video that simply said, we've got your back, and we'll do everything we can as this city to make sure that we honor every resident here, it made a world of difference. And so with your playbook, I hope one of the things you encourage mayors to do is to use their bully pulpit every chance they get. And not forget this, we represent the same footprint that our United States House of Representatives represent.
That's right.
And we have every bit of power, if not greater access to the people, to encourage them and to remind them that we are the cities and for all people who happen to be residents in our footprint. So I hope you would put that as part of your footprint, your blueprint, Mayor Garcetti. And mayors use the bully pulpit to encourage everyone and remind them, we've got your back.
Superb. Thank you so much, Mayor Hancock. And I've seen a few mayors who've done this throughout the country. I think that is great. It goes viral, and especially for young people, it really resonates and hits them. It's something they can pass on better and distribute. But we're not always the most effective at getting to young people and communicating to them, but that is a way to do it. Shane Bemis, who is a great mayor of Gresham, Oregon, is going to be man with the next question. Thank you for standing with us today as well, Shane.
Very good. Thank you, mayors. Thank you so much for the leadership. As my colleagues have said, I've never been more proud to be a member of this organization as I am today. One of the things I love most about this organization is the fact that we can come together, irrespective of party, to advance the things that are going to continue to make our cities better and thrive more. So thank you all for the leadership. And Tom, thank you to yourself and the staff. It was no small task to get this together and get it through the executive committee, so appreciate that. This is one that hits home for us in Gresham. We're a suburb of Portland, Oregon. We have about 20% Latino, Hispanic and Latino population in our community. About 17% of our residents are born outside of the United States, and we have over 60 languages that are spoken in our community. So as this last year has gone on, we knew that there was angst building in certain segments of our community. But I didn't know to what degree it was building or how powerful it was until one day a young Latino man that works in my office, energetic young man that started working for us as an intern, has done great work in our city, revitalizing the neighborhood that he grew up in, came walking down the hall to me, and you could see the fear on this young man's face. And so we talked to him, and here's a kid, it dawned on me, young man, I shouldn't call him a kid, young man, who's college educated, born in my city, and is fearful about what this means for his family, his mother, his father, and was looking for answers. Now, he is in the halls of power, right? He's in the government. He understands how we work, but he doesn't have any clue what's going on and is fearful about it. So my question, after that, we held a series of community meetings with our police department, who play an incredible role in this. And we took a lot of feedback. We did a lot of reassuring. We did a lot of that parenting that you spoke of, Mayor Garcetti. But my question is, and some of this is going to come later, I think, in some of the toolbox that you're going to roll out, what are the other things that we can do as mayors to reassure the community that if they call 911, we're going to be there to help and protect and not to harm? Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe the chief wants to add anything to this. We had my police chief, Charlie Beck. I mean, there's nothing like a man or woman in uniform actually delivering the message, even more than a mayor, because they're the ones who you expect after 911. You know, in Los Angeles, we've been called, you know, Sanctuary City because Sanctuary City, by the way, historically, I think many of you know, comes out of Central American refugee movement a long time ago. It's been kind of perverted and changed by people opposed to immigration to mean anything they don't like that we do. But Special Order 40 was something that came out of a very unprogressive police chief in Los Angeles named Daryl Gates, who wasn't known for being very racially or culturally progressive, but knew that he didn't want his cops to be immigration agents and that he would lose the trust of the very people he needed to solve crime and protect our community. So I think it is important for all of us to speak to our police chiefs and our leaders and to get them to publicly speak, not just us. It's expected that we do. Some chiefs are great and do that. Other ones maybe are not as used to it, but there's a pretty universal consensus, I think, in law enforcement. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Chief, as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I would just say that engagement, just engage with the community constantly. I mean, we have lots of language service. We work very closely with other city agencies and advocates for immigrants and refugees. But we really need to get out there at every level of our police organization. And I think the mayor's right. When the message comes from the police and they know that they can trust the police, I think then that reduces a lot of the fear. And I think we really need to focus, as I said earlier, on the next generation, on building those relationships. I was telling Mayor Murray, a young man approached me. I'm teaching a class at Seattle University in the evening, one night a week, and a young man approached me, and he said that he was brought here at age 3 from Mexico by his family. Didn't realize until he was 18 years old that he was undocumented, and now is in college, pursuing his education, and very fearful that his future is uncertain at this point. And I took the time to sit with him and reassure him that in our city, under our mayor's leadership, and with our police department's policies, that he's safe, and that we'll do whatever we can to help him through his difficult times. But I think we've all heard those stories recently, and I think it's engagement and reassurance, and I think it comes from our mayors, but it also needs to come from our police leaders as well.
Mindful of the time, we have, I think, one more comment from one more mayor, from Mayor Aquanetta Warren. One thing I'd add to that is to our schools. I think a lot of parents, when you drop a kid off at school, are worried, and I think having that talk, to have school officials say, look, this is not a place where immigration officials come in. Not that we lock the doors, but we just don't do that with law enforcement in general. The schools are a safe place, and then if they need to talk to somebody that's outside these school grounds, I think that's a good place to reassure people too. But Aquanetta Warren is the fantastic mayor of Fontana, California. I know we're a little California heavy between the three of us now, but thank you for your great leadership on this, Aquanetta, and leave the last comment to you.
I just wanted to say that we all have the power to engage our communities, particularly our faith-based communities. We have to go to the churches. That's where everyone is. And we have to get our pastors involved. And pastors have a way of soothing calmness. And we have to be part of that calmness. We need to bring our officers to those places of worship so that people can engage and feel comfortable with them. That's what I'm going to be doing this year. I'm going to make sure my playbook involves the faith-based community. We have a really strong faith-based group that meets with our police chief now, and we want them to reach out to everyone. And we need to change the face of this AK, whatever, immigrant, to understand that it's an American face. We have people coming from everywhere. We have Haitians. We have Asians. We have to stop the border discussion and start talking about the people discussion. That's how we get people to calm down. And the fear is real. The fear is real. And what better place but in the house of worship to have these discussions where people are comfortable. So that will be part of the playbook that we will play in Fontana this year. Awesome. And I hope that the rest of you will do the same. And we need to have a section of this group to include the faith-based community, the faith-based leaders, just as we've included police and police chiefs. That's where you make the full circle. And that's when people begin to visualize. We are all Americans. We just need to work together.
Amen.
Thank you for your leadership.
Well, what a powerful last statement. Thank you, Aquanetta. Know that Providence moves in mysterious ways. This conference and another conference of bishops, and there's all sorts of, are already having discussions about ways to engage the new administration and really take, again, that ethical look at what this issue is all about. We've had we could probably do this for 3 or 4 hours. I just want to underscore this one thing. When people stand up and say this is one of the proudest moments of this organization has always stood up. When it was civil rights, a couple days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, when it's been on equality for everybody, whether it's been on immigration issues, this is really a place where we put aside those labels. And thank you all. Let's make sure now that the enacting of those principles is what the fight is about. Let's hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and let's be strong together and don't cede the power we have before we exercise it. We have that responsibility to everybody we represent and for them to have a brighter day. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Sure. This is awesome. Over here. All right, we're going to take one group photo, guys. Yeah, exactly. Come on over. We're going to take a group picture. Yes, sir. Yeah, hey, come on up, brother. You good? Nice to see you.